There, I wanted to put it on to here. Okay. You're gonna think it's like the first time I'm doing this. Let me try one more time. Share with sound. Share. Okay. So like I say, you're gonna watch a short video. It's officially 15 minutes, but I'm putting it on 1.25 speed, so it'll be faster. You'll learn the Gemara. I'll put the words, the text on the screen. We're going to deal with some of the questions that come up and as arise as the from the Gemara that people don't necessarily think about. And then if there's time, we're also going to we'll answer some of those questions, and then we're going to learn further into the Gemara. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is take a look at this video. Again, if you've seen this, this is put up by Ir David Megalim. They have a whole series of videos which are magnificent, but I think it's something worthwhile to start before we look at the Gemara. Get bad. I don't know. 1 second. I've had this problem before. Second. Okay. This is the Tisha B'Av issue coming here. Just a second. Okay, let's try this. Let's see if it works now. My apologies for all this back and forth.
In the spring of the year 70 CE, Titus marches his legions from the coastal plain to Jerusalem. He's boiling with anger. It has been 4 years, and the Roman army has not succeeded in suppressing the stubborn revolt that broke out in Judea. The Jews fight courageously for every piece of land. Even the esteemed commander Vespasian, Titus' father, could not defeat them. Now, after his father's appointment to emperor, it's Titus' turn to manage the campaign. He commands the most powerful war machine in the world, tens of thousands of trained legionnaires, equipped with advanced weapons, sophisticated breaching tools, and lethal artillery. Against the mighty Roman army stands a small force of fighters who will fight for their freedom until their last drop of blood. The final battle of the Great Revolt against Rome begins. It will be a battle that will never be forgotten. In the dark of night, Titus brings up his soldiers from 3 directions to Jerusalem. As dawn breaks on the 14th of Nisan, the eve of Passover, the residents of Jerusalem awaken to a sight that makes their blood run cold. 60,000 Roman soldiers, thirsty for war, surrounded the city from every direction. Only now, when the Romans stand at the gates of the city, does the tragedy caused by the civil war raging in the city become clear. In clashes between the various factions, whole sections of Jerusalem were destroyed. Stores of food that could have provided vital provisions during the fighting and siege went up in flames and vanished. Too late, the rebels join forces against the true enemy. What they lack in weaponry and soldiers will be reinforced by acts of bravery and unrestrained daring. The Jews take the initiative and respond quickly. They attack ferociously before the Romans take up positions. The surprised Romans scatter in all directions. Titus himself escapes by the skin of his teeth. Before the Romans manage to recover, the Jews retreat behind the mighty defenses of the walls of Jerusalem. These walls are Titus' main problem. Jerusalem is built on a hill and surrounded by 3 fortified walls, each stronger than the other. To breach such a wall, Titus must raise huge earthen ramps and bring up siege towers and battering rams to reach it. In excavations conducted in Jerusalem, in the Russian compound, remains of the 3rd wall have been found. It is the outer wall of the ancient city. We have here testimony to the battle. We found more than 70 catapult stones right here at the front of the wall, so that we know a battle took place here. The number and density of the catapult stones and their locations are basically the testimony that there was a battle here during the Roman period, dated according to the potsherds. The evidence enabled us to conclude that we are dealing with a section of the 3rd wall through which the Romans penetrated Jerusalem. With these huge catapult stones, Titus' soldiers bombarded the Jewish defenders, thus ensuring that they would not disturb the builds of the ramping. Each of these stones weighs about 26 kilograms and flew at a speed of tens of kilometers per hour. When a stone like this crashed into the wall, it was better not to be there. Under heavy artillery cover, the iron rams climbed to the top of the wall and pierced it. The noise is deafening. The largest battering ram of all, nicknamed Nikon, the victor, was the first to breach the wall. The Roman soldiers burst into Beit Zeta neighborhood. They slaughter the residents without mercy and set the entire neighborhood on fire. Within a few days, the second wall also falls. The Jewish defenses begin to disintegrate. Titus renews the attack and advances his soldiers to the internal wall, the strongest wall of Jerusalem, known as the First Wall. He concentrates most of his efforts here at the Antonia fortress. The Antonia is the largest, strongest fortress in Jerusalem. It was built by Herod to the north of the Temple Mount in order to control the temple. Titus' plan was well thought out. The moment the Antonia falls, the temple will fall. And when the temple falls, the Jews will lose all hope and Jerusalem will finally fall into his hands. But nothing prepared him for what happens next. In a daring action, the soldiers of John of Giscala succeed in digging a tunnel under the earthen ramp opposite the Antonia, setting fire to its foundations and toppling it together with the soldiers to the ground. At the same time, Simon Bar Giora attacks the ramp opposite the first wall and sets it on fire. Hundreds of Roman soldiers are killed and wounded. All at once, the Roman attack is halted and the entire Roman army is driven out of the city. Stunned by the failure.
Did you know that there's an endless supply of free electricity constantly flowing in the ground beneath you?
I guess we know it now.
Titus gathers his commanders urgently and decides to change tactics. If it is not possible to break into the city, he will surround it from without and starve the Jews to death. In a record time of only 3 days, Titus builds a giant siege wall around Jerusalem, a choke ring 7 kilometers long that effectively blocks off all supply lines. Now, starvation sets in to cruelly afflict the city. Affluent people scour the gutters to find scraps of food, and small children whose parents have starved to death wander the streets in search of a piece of bread. The tension in the city grows. Those who are left with a little food eat in secret. Others try to evade the zealots and escape from the city. Most of those who try to flee are caught by the Romans and crucified on wooden beams around the city walls. Fatigue and starvation weaken the Jewish fighters. This is Titus' chance to deal the crushing blow to Jerusalem. The Roman army is concentrated on one task: to conquer Antonia fortress and break through to the temple. The Jews tried to prevent the capture of the Temple Mount and sabotage the building of the ramps. They shot flaming arrows, threw giant stones, and poured boiling oil on the head of the Roman soldiers. In the Temple Mount sifting project, iron arrowheads were found. These arrowheads were used for catapult fire. Catapults are machines for shooting arrows, and they bombarded the walls with such force that even the bravest of the Jewish fighters could not withstand. After fierce battles, Titus' soldiers gained control of the Antonia. On the 17th of Tammuz, Titus commands them to destroy the mighty citadel down to its foundations. This day, on which according to tradition the city was breached, is commemorated as a day of mourning on the Jewish calendar. The temple service ceased completely, and during the following 3 weeks, the days between the straits, the Jews would struggle in bloody face-to-face battles in the courtyards of God's temple. The battering rams breached the western walls of the Temple Mount. Ladders are leaned against the remains of the wall, and the Roman soldiers stream en masse into the temple courtyard. It seems that the campaign is drawing to a close, but what happens next is totally inconceivable. When the Jews realize that the temple is in real danger, they shake off all feelings of hunger and weakness. Thousands of citizens, women, men, elders, and youth, everyone who can hold a weapon, join the fighters. Together, as one man, they fall upon the Romans and block the way to the temple with their bodies. Only one weapon can beat the fire of faith that burns in the hearts of the Jewish fighters, the burning fire of torches. And thus, on the night of the 9th of Av, Titus sets fire to the gates that surround the Temple Mount. On their way to the temple, the Romans burst through, killing, stabbing, and trampling everyone in their path. The blood flows on the colorful stone floors of the Temple Mount as bodies of the slain pile high. The flames quickly spread and approach the entrance to the temple. A moment before it goes up in flames, Titus gathers his commanders for a final consultation to determine the fate of the temple. Josephus claims that Titus opposed destroying the temple, which in his eyes was the glory of human creation. According to Josephus, the fire was caused by accident by a Roman soldier who inadvertently tossed a burning torch into the sanctuary. But most scholars do not believe this is really true. The anger over the many casualties caused by the Jews and the understanding that as long as the temple stood, the Jews would continue to fight, decided the temple's fate. Let them see and fear. On the 9th of Av, towards evening, Titus gave the order, and the following day, the 10th of Av, his soldiers set fire to the sanctuary. The temple that had been the source of inspiration, faith, ethics, and righteousness for the Jewish people and all humanity for centuries now went up in flames.
Right. You can read, you can see, you can visit the Kotel, you can visit the Har HaBayit, and sometimes just a little visual gives you a very different or maybe a more visceral connection to what happened. I know that there are many organizations and camps around the world, and I've seen this myself, that had children and teenagers early in the summer building a project, and then on Tisha B'Av to have it burned down, to just get that feeling, that emotion of what that loss is. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the screen the text of the Gemara. We're going to learn it together. I'll make it big so you can see it. Just a minute. We're going to start right here. Okay. The Gemara in Gittin, which was Daf Yomi not that long ago, it deals with multiple topics having to do with Yerushalayim and others. And this part of the Gemara, after having talked about the topic of what we call the Sikrikin, the bullies, the Sikari, S-I-C-R-I-I, and actually, I guess it's Latin, now segues into another topic. That topic is the eventual destruction of Beit HaMikdash. Most people who are familiar with the first couple words or lines of this Gemara are familiar with the idea, okay, that because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. So we're going to go through some of this, raise some questions, and we're going to see it's not so clear. Not is it not clear that we're going to raise some questions that may shift how you look at this topic altogether. But it starts off with a quote. For those of you who are learning with me, Mesilat Yesharim, we just used this quote the other day in Mesilat Yesharim. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my dichtiv. What is it when it says in the Gemara? Maybe I should make this a little bigger so you can actually see it better. There. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my dichtiv. Ashrei adam mefached tamid u'maksheh libo yipol bera'ah. What does it mean when it says in Mishlei, a person should be constantly, a person is happy if they're constantly in fear, but who hardens his heart would fall into mischief. What does that pasuk mean? That pasuk is the introduction to the next 2.5 pages of Gemara, and we're going to see how it's going to play a part if we get to it in answering some of our questions. Now, I'm going to be looking at my Gemara, not the screen, so hopefully when I get to the bottom line, I'll make sure to change the slide. Okay, so now it tells us about 3 things. Tells us, what does that pasuk refer to? Akamsa bar Kamsa chavar Yerushalayim. Because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the city of Yerushalayim was destroyed. Atarnagolta v'tarnagolta charuv Tur Malka, and because of a rooster and a hen, the city of Tur Malka, which in English translated is King's Mountain, was destroyed. Ashaka derisbak charuv Beitar, and the city of Beitar was destroyed because of a shaft or an axle on a chariot. Now, we're not going to get to, I don't think, we're not going to get to those 2 other situations. We're going to talk more about the first one. The question is, are we allowed to even learn those other 2 today? The answer would be more than likely yes, because it also talks about destruction. indirectly relating to Yerushalayim. So now after listing the three situations in which this pasuk referred to, Ashrei Adam Mefatechei Tamid, it's going to now start off with the narrative having to do with Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. So if you're following along here, we're right over here, the last word on the line, where it says Akamsa. Akamsa Bar Kamsa Charu Yerushalayim. Because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the city of Yerushalayim was destroyed. And now it tells us the story. Dahu Gavra, there was a man. The Rachme Kamsa Ubal Devavet Bar Kamsa. There's this guy who was a good friend of a man named Kamsa, and his enemy's name was Bar Kamsa. Amarle Lishmaye. So this guy whom we don't know who he is, we know nothing about him. All we know is that he is about to make a party. He said to his servant, Zilaiti the Kamsa, go and bring me Kamsa. What does that mean? It wasn't like you have today. You put a WhatsApp message out and suddenly you have people coming to a party. It meant that he was to go to with an invitation to go to the house of Kamsa and invite him to come to the party. What did he do by accident? Also, I delay Bar Kamsa. He went by accident and he mistakenly invited Bar Kamsa, meaning the enemy of the guy. Ata ashkache dahave yati. So Bar Kamsa, who probably was pretty shocked to get invited, why do you think he went? I'm not going to discuss this too much, but it's not a rhetorical question. Why do you think he went, Bar Kamsa? So if you want to put yourself into his mind, no, what I'm saying is that when we read a Gemara like this or a story that you're familiar with, you don't necessarily come up with I never thought about that part. So did you ever think about why would he go? You make a part, you have a person, hopefully you don't hate anybody and no one hates you, but you're in a bad situation with somebody and you get an invitation to their wedding. You're going to go. You're not going to go. You're going to go to it's a party. It's not a wedding. It's a party in their house. So maybe he thought, Bar Kamsa thought, oh, the guy wants to make shalom. He wants to make peace. Okay, so he'll go. So in the middle of the party, the host goes and he says, Ata ashkechei dahavayati. He saw that he was sitting there, Bar Kamsa. Amarle, Michti ahu gavra baal de baba ahu gavra hu my bait hacha. He said, this guy, he's my enemy. He says, what are you doing here? Kum pok, get up, get out of here. Amarle, so he said, Hoel va'ata shafrakan, v'hevna lach d'meimad achilna v'shatina. Tell you what, I don't want to be embarrassed. Because getting thrown out of your party would be pretty embarrassing. I'll make you a deal. You let me stay here, and I will pay you for whatever I eat and drink. Okay? You don't have to even pay for my food. Amar lo. He said to him, no. Okay, it's the next page. Let me just go to the next page. We're at the very top of the line here. Amar lo. He says, no, I'm not going to let you stay. Get out. Amar yahevna lach demei palga de sudate. This is a pretty good deal. He said, in order to save my embarrassment, I will pay for half the cost of this entire party. Amarle, so the host said, no, still no good. Amarle, kula sudatech. Can you imagine the hatred that the host had to have had for this Bar Kamsa? That Bar Kamsa offered to pay the entire value of the party. Who knows how much it was? And nevertheless, Amarle lo, no, nakte biyadeva, maybe apke. So the host took Bar Kamsa by the hand. He pulled him, he dragged him up, and he threw him out. Amar. Now, you have to think about something here. You have to put yourselves into a place. I want you to picture you're at this party. Would not have been a good thing to be at, by the way. I'm going to see in a second why. You're at this party, and this event takes place. And you're just a person from the neighborhood. You're at the party. So, okay, you maybe see this scuffle, this back and forth, and you may even have overheard what was being said. You'll say, can I have another plate of wings? You may not have cared. But the problem was, and this is where the beginning of the end starts, at least for this story, the problem was that there were some people there who should have opened their mouths. Amar, so he said, so Bar Kamsa said it right over here, right in the middle. It says Amar. So Bar Kamsa said to himself, because there were a bunch of rabbis sitting there, and they didn't go over to the host and say, what are you doing? They didn't say anything to the host about humiliating this man. means that they didn't care. They were happy. Whatever happened, they threw them out. Now, you have to ask yourself another question first. What were they doing there? This isn't a kiddush on Shabbat. This is a party, and a party in that time with Romans and others did not mean that they're sitting there just learning daf yom. If you get my drift. So as a result, and we're going to see why that's going to play a part, obviously. And as a result, so what did he do? He says, I'm going to go and I'm going to be a malshin. I'm going to be a talebearer against the king, against the Jews. Azal Amar the Caesar. He went and he said to the Caesar, to the king, Mardu Bach Yehudai. The Jews have rebelled against you. Now, at this time, the Romans were, Judea was a province, was under the rule of the Romans. And the worst thing that could happen was that the citizens of one of the provinces of the Roman Empire will want to rebel against the king. That'd be the worst thing. So he claims, he went to the king, and he says to the king, the Jews are rebelling against you. Like, who says? I mean, very nice, you're telling me this, but give me some proof. Amarle, so he said to them, to the king, Shadaruhu kurbanat, chazit imi karvinle. Send a sacrifice to the Beit HaMikdash. See if the Jews will bring it. Now, you may know already that they would. Why? What would be the problem? There should be no problem because we know, if you look in Sefer Melachim Aleph, Perek Chet, when Shlomo first begins the service of the Beit HaMikdash, one of the things he says is that it's for the whole world. Yes, the Jews have a closer affinity and we can do more things and we can come into the Beit HaMikdash closer. But to bring a korban to Hashem in the Beit HaMikdash by a non-Jew was doable. So he says, you send a korban and see what happens. So what happens? Azal shadar b'idei eglatilta. So the emperor went and he sent a calf. It's a 3-year-old calf. It was supposed to be like the best calf. But in the meantime, while they were coming towards the Beit HaMikdash, shada be muma b'niv svatayim. What did Bar Kamsa do? He had such animosity and such hatred building in his heart. He knew that the korban would be brought. He knows the rules. But what did he do? He took a knife and he either made a little blemish in the lip of the animal or in the eye of the animal, which in fact that for us would be considered a mum, a blemish, and the korban could not be brought. But as far as the non-Jewish world was concerned, who also brought sacrifices to their, quote, gods, that wouldn't have been a move. So what is he doing? Bar Kamsa is stacking the deck. He told the king, the Jews are not going to bring your animal. He brings an animal that was absolutely kosher to be brought. Bar Kamsa goes ahead and messes up the game. He puts a little blemish in this animal, which he knows will cause the Jews to not bring it on the Beit HaMikdash. Why? What's his goal? Because he wants he's taking revenge for how he was treated. He's taking revenge ultimately against the whole Jewish people. So what happens? Now, Bar Kamsa comes with this animal. He comes with this animal. They bring it towards the Beit HaMikdash. And the rabbis are in a quandary. They have a problem now. Problem is, on the one hand, they thought, you know what? We really should bring this korban because we have to keep peace with the government. So let's just do it. Comes along another player, Amarlahu Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulis. So a man named Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulis, who happens to have been, without going to the background now, one of the Gedolim of the time. He was one of the greatest sages of the time. So he said, wait a minute. We got a problem, dude. If we bring this korban with the moon, I understand the Shlom Malchut and all that, trying to keep peace with the government. We have an internal problem if we bring that. Why? Yomru, people will say, the Jews will say, Bale Mumin Krevin Legabe Mizbeach. We saw that they brought this animal. It had a little moon, a little blemish maybe in the lip. And therefore, if we have an animal that has a little blemish, we also can do it. So they say, oh, you're right. What are we going to do here? I don't know. What do you think we should do? Savala Miktale. They thought, you know what we should do? We should murder Bar Kamsa. Things get worse. Some of the rabbis said we need to buy Kamsa a pair of cement shoes and drop him in the Mediterranean. Or we could say in modern time, Luca Brazzi sleeps with the fishes. Why would we kill him? It's not Stam, just so he wouldn't go run back to the king and tell him it wasn't brought. Amar lahu Rabbi Zechariah. Wait a minute. Zechariah ben Avkuli says that's even worse. Why? Yomru, if people see and they connect the dots, they're going to make the following statement. If a person puts a mum, purposefully puts a blemish in an animal that's to be brought as a korban, it's a death sentence. We would want people to think that. So now here's the situation. Bar Kamsa gets thrown out. He's humiliated. The rabbis sit around, they don't open their mouths. Bar Kamsa sets up the stage to have the Jews get in trouble because he brings this animal, puts a mum in it. They're about to bring it, and rabbis say we got to do this to keep the peace. And that meant one individual named Zechariah ben Avkuli says, no, we can't do that. People are going to say, it's like, what would the neighbors say? What would the neighbors say? They say, wait, you might, if you bring it, you're allowed to bring a korban that has a sacrifice that has a blemish. Okay, you know what we're going to do? Let's kill him. Let's kill Bar Kamsa. No, Zechariah ben Avkuli says, no chance, because what's going to happen? People are going to say if you put a mum on purpose, a blemish on purpose in an animal that's supposed to be a korban, it's the death sentence, and that's not true. So how are they going to resolve this whole problem? They don't. They don't bring the korban. What ends up happening? It tells us in the Gemara, next few words, right here where it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, right over here. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Listen to these words. Very often people quote this Gemara and say, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Because of them, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Yerushalayim was destroyed, but they kind of missed this line. Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, An v'tanuto shabi Zechariah ben Avkulis, the excessive humility, and we're putting that in quotes right now because it doesn't seem to make sense. The humility, humbleness, but there's no such word, of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulis, hechariva beitenu, caused our Beit HaMikdash to be destroyed. B'sarfat hechalenu, burn the sanctuary. Heglitanu mi'artzenu, and to be exiled from our land. That's a little stronger than the statement that was made about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa hechariv Yerushalayim. That's a pretty broad statement that because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, Yerushalayim was destroyed. Now it's telling us because of this one man, Zechariah ben Avkulis, because of his, quote, excessive humility, what happened? Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, the sanctuary was burned, and we're thrown into Galut, into the exile. Some obvious questions. May not be obvious, but they're questions. Let's start with mention some of the questions, and we're going to start talking about some of them. And then, time permitting, which it will, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to continue the Gemara. Because right now, we were told is that the Yerushalayim gets destroyed, the Beit HaMikdash gets destroyed, but what was the whole series of events and what actually happened in some of the issue of the Yad Hashem and all? We're gonna get back to Gemara. So let's talk about a few things. How do we resolve the fact? By the way, there is whatever I'm going to tell you now, because I have in front of me a bunch of papers. I did some research for this class. There is no definitive 100% answer to any of these things that I'm going to talk to you about. I'm just going to give you some opinions. Some of these I'm not just going to read to you because considering it's Tisha B'Av, and as you've been fasting for since last night, the brain won't easily just transmit what I will do in my head, and I'll read some of it. But one of the first things you want to deal with is, why is it mentioning Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? What exactly was their enmity? What was their argument? What was the problem between them? And a subset of that question is, what did Kamsa do? The poor guy. And forever, his name is attached to the story of the destruction of Yerushalayim. He didn't do anything. He's the guy who was supposed to come to the party. He's the guy who was mistaken, and then they take the butler, whoever goes and gets Bar Kamsa. He's just sitting in his house watching TV and Netflix. I mean, what's the problem here? What did he do? Second question is, how do we resolve this? That on the one hand, we have Kamsa and Bar Kamsa mentioned as the cause for the destruction. On the other hand, we have it's Zechariah ben Avkulis. Which is it? Is it both of them? Maybe it's both of them. It's a combination. So if we had a few hours together, we would be learning another Gemara. The Gemara is also found in the Talmud Yerushalmi. The story is told from not a very, but a little bit different perspective. And the purpose of the different stories is also, or the reason for the different stories is the bias from which it is told. We're only going to tell the story and answer some of these questions based on the perspective of the Talmud Bavli. As I say, Yerushalmi has different perspective, and we're going to see from one opinion here, which I think was brilliant. At least it's incisive. It has really good comment about what they did. So we're going to talk about the Maharal and the Maharshal. The Maharal from Prague. By the way, I hate to burst your bubble. For those of you who have heard the story of the Maharal made a golem and that made a golem out of earth. The story was debunked many years ago. Even though there were stories that supposedly that during the time of the World War II, the Nazis went into some shul where the golem's body was supposed to have been, and they all died somehow. Again, there was some scholarly paper, I'd never seen it, but I've heard of it, that said it never happened. But okay, but that's this Maharal. Maharal has a commentary on the Agadata in Shas. The Agadata is the legends, the lore, the stories, which are all there to teach us something. And he tells us a few things. He said that there really was a much deeper, basic cause for the destruction. And it wasn't Kamsa and Bar Kamsa that really was the cause of the ultimate destruction, but that they were the quintessential symptom, not the disease. What do we know is the disease? In other words, if I ask you, if you were talking right now here in person, and I were asking you to ask you, what caused the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash? Everyone's going to give the same answer. Sinat Chinam, because that's the Gemara tells us. Wait a minute. If the Gemara tells us Sinat Chinam, what's this whole story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? Okay. Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the whole story is the story of Sinat Chinam. But the overarching reason was Sinat Chinam. It wasn't just limited to this one story. Had it been limited to just this story, I would be very hard pressed to believe that the Beit HaMikdash would be destroyed for one specific incident. As we go through some of these topics or some of these questions and answers, in the back of your head, I want you to keep in mind the rhetoric that's happening today in the streets. I don't mean Tisha B'Av Day, but in general, it's been happening. So we know the Gemara in Yoma tells us that the destruction of Beit HaMikdash was because of Sinat Chinam. And it's also, as I say, quite apparent and quite obvious throughout this bit of Gemara we did so far, that there was this underlying lack of unity, there was disrespect, there was no shame in shaming somebody publicly. It's not just that the rabbis who should have said something, we're going to come back to them in a minute, they're going to get raked over the coals, that they should have, but the people themselves at the party. Imagine again, you're at a party. Now, today, not on Tisha B'Av, next year on Tisha B'Av, but you're at a party, and whatever it is, the person, engagement party, and you hear the host yelling and screaming at somebody, get out, I don't want you here at all. How would you feel? Would you intercede? Would you not intercede? Would you try to calm things down? But it is evident that nothing, no one spoke up. And Kal V'chomer, the problem was that the rabbis did. The Maharal Prague says that, it tells us that the great gain that Am Yisrael had by having the Beit HaMikdash was at the time that they built the Beit HaMikdash, the bamot, private altars, were prohibited from that point on forever. In other words, you can't go in your backyard today and put an altar and sacrifice an animal. You may say, oh, I want to bring a korban. You can't do it anymore. From the time it was called the Heter Bamot, between the two Batei Mikdash, and before the first one, you could have a private altar. Once the second Beit HaMikdash was built, no private altar. Everyone had to daven in the same shul, so to speak. Everyone had to unify to one place to bring korbanot. And one of the benefits, the grand benefits of the Beit HaMikdash was it created achdus. It created unity. It created coming together. It created the harmony of Am Yisrael, because they had one place to worship Hashem. Yes, there already was a concept of tefillah, different than we have today, but to a degree. But there was one place to bring korbanot, Beit HaMikdash. Once it became clear, says the Maharal, once it became clear that there was this split in Am Yisrael, and that the underlying theme of this split was Sinat Chinam, it was pilug, it was splitting and not coming together. And the quibbling, that fighting and the infighting was the exact opposite of the purpose of Beit HaMikdash, and I would say even greater. It was the purpose of Yerushalayim, and I'll prove that in a second. Then things begin to fall apart, says the Maharal, and Bnei Yisrael do not deserve that Beit HaMikdash. How am I going to prove to you that Yerushalayim is also, the idea is unification? It's a pasuk in Tehillim. We know it. What's the pasuk? It says, Yerushalayim is an ir shechubra lah yachtav. It is a city that unites. Now, how does that work today? How does that work in the face of all the political ramifications? Different discussion. But when there's deep hatred among the Jews, this idea of having the Beit HaMikdash, which is there to unify, cannot stand. It can't last. The Maharal also tells us that Rebbe Zechariah ben Avkulis did not really cause the destruction, but he was really a pawn, or a, shouldn't use the word pawn, that's negative. He was a shaliach of Hashem. Hashem had decided, again, this is the theory of the Maharal, Hashem had decided that because of this terrible schism and this split, and we're going to see if we get to the Gemara, it gets much worse than so far you've seen, that Hashem decreed the Beit HaMikdash was going to be destroyed. That's it. And Reb Zechariah ben Avkulis was the shaliach, or the conduit through which the next series of events were to happen, then brought about the Beit HaMikdash's destruction. The Chachamim wanted to try to save the situation. They wanted to try to annul the decree and try to make peace with the king. Now, if you look at what the Chachamim wanted, the rabbis, the Chachamim, they said, let's bring it for Shalom Malchut. Want to make peace with the government. And on the other hand, Reb Zechariah ben Avkulis, no, God forbid, no. Okay. Had the government, had they put the animal through, had they tried to work for Shalom Malchut and said, we don't care what the one guy might say, make a mistake and say that you can make a blemish in a korban, this is a much grander problem here. If we don't bring this korban, then in that case, the Maharal says, it is possible that the Beit HaMikdash would not have been destroyed. But he kind of mollifies the statement of the Gemara that it was because of Zechariah ben Avkulis that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, but he means that the Zechariah ben Avkulis ultimately became the final linchpin to which Hashem worked. The Maharsha gives us a similar explanation, and he said also that the decree had already been signed. Hashem already decided that the Beit HaMikdash was going to be destroyed, but built into that decree, now this is the Maharsha, he says that the built into the decree was that had the Roman emperor shown compassion and decided to spare the Beit HaMikdash, it is possible that the Beit HaMikdash would have stayed. But now that Reb Zechariah ben Avkulis didn't allow this korban to be brought, the emperor became exceedingly angry. He felt it was redundant since the Jews had not accepted a sacrifice. They can't accept my sacrifice. What do they need a Beit HaMikdash for? I'm going to destroy it. The way the Gemara can be understood is there's no real specific mention of the animosity between Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right? There's no clear statement. As I asked, why is Kamsa's name mentioned? We're going to have a few answers to that, but this is one opinion. It seems to have nothing to do with the story. The Maharal does say something. I'm going to read to you in English what Maharal says about why do we blame Kamsa? Why not just say the Gemara, doesn't the Gemara say, because of Bar Kamsa, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed? It says as follows. It says it means that the Kamsa also played a key role. This is not a direct English translation. This is a free translation. Is that Kamsa also played a key role because if his involvement was merely a mistake, the Gemara would have not implied that he too was also part of the story. Like I said, why mention him if he has nothing to do with the story? So the Maharal explains, the mere fact that Kamsa was a friend of the host was sufficient to suggest that he had an animosity with Bar Kamsa. As we know, causeless hatred and arguments were rife at that time. In such an atmosphere, everyone takes sides. In fact, the host of the party was only interested in Kamsa being his friend so that he could help him with his arguments with Bar Kamsa. Why? How do we know that? We're going to see that in a few minutes with some other opinion. The Maharal writes that sometime when two people are friends, in reality, that friendship is divisive because its real purpose is to make trouble with others. So the Maharal is telling us that Kamsa was not a an innocent individual. He was also a person who was friends with this guy. Imagine you get called the day after this mythical party that you were at today, where the host was screaming and yelling and was absolutely irrational and throwing somebody out. And someone calls you up and said, I heard what your friend did last night. How would you bristle at being called a friend of that person at that moment? Like, you don't want to be associated with him. But the time that time there were cliques. What was it that Kamsa was part of a clique? He was part of a clique that this unnamed host was a part of, and not only a part of, but what must have been some form of a gang leader. I don't mean the gang as far as like gangs. And therefore, his association alone with someone like that, his tremendous amount of already sinat chinam, not necessarily with Bar Kamsa, but possibly we'll see that with somebody else, is already a reason to have his name mentioned along the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Now, it's interesting. I've mentioned just briefly about the position of the rabbis in this story. Where do we have the rabbis mentioned? We have them mentioned 3 times. Number 1, they're mentioned when they're at the party and they didn't do anything. They're mentioned when they are vacillating between what to do with this korban. Some are saying we should just do it because of Shalom Malchut, making peace with the government. And they were mentioned as an individual was Chai ben Akulis. I'm going to read something to you. It's only a couple paragraphs. I came across, for those of you familiar with Sefaria, I'm sure you all are. If not, you should become familiar with it. It has in it not just thousands and tens of thousands of pages of text, but it also has Divrei Torah and all kinds of papers and documents. It's just a magnificent well in which one can draw a tremendous amount of water. And I use that because that metaphor because we say, Shiur says, Torah is water. I'm going to read to you something it says here. He first was talking about the text in the Talmud Bavli versus the Talmud Yerushalmi. These the ones called Kamsa and Kamtsutza. It's just a very different, interesting story. But I want to focus on what he says here about the Talmud Bavli story. He's talking now about the rabbis, and what this story really is all about is also leadership / rabbinic failure. We know from other places in the Gemara, and actually in the Mishnah also, that a generation gets the leaders it deserves, which can be a good thing and could be a not so good thing. We're talking about a time of tremendous amounts of sinat chinam. It also indicates, therefore, that the leadership may not have been, even though they may have been great tzaddikim and gedolim, they may not have been the best as far as being able to guide the people. Because had they been the best in being able to guide the people, then the sinat chinam would have been a public debate to the point where the rabbis and the leaders would have made it very clear. There's no record of that. We're talking about things that the Nevi'im, whether it was Yirmiyahu or others before the first Beit HaMikdash, all these other things, there was nothing said here. So let's take a look. I'm going to read this to you. It says, regarding rabbinic leadership and the failure, when at the banquet they should have taken a stand to promote peace, they sat silently. In the temple, now, at the party, first of all, what the heck are they doing there? Second of all, they're quiet. But now, at the Beit HaMikdash, when there's a korban that's about to be brought, suddenly they're concerned with peace. Okay? Notice how he compares these two situations. On the one hand, they're quiet with public humiliation, no problem, they're at a party. But when it comes to religious stuff, suddenly they have to become a little bit more thoughtful, religious, and they're concerned about shalom.
It's national stuff over the.
It's nationalist. It's national, right? It's national, but the secondary one for Rav Zechariah ben Akulis is religious.
That's true. Right.
Okay, so now what happens is their shortcomings prevent them from acting. Twice the rabbis balked at what, in retrospect, are crucial moments. They can intervene at the banquet and prevent Kamsa's expulsion, but they don't. They can intervene with the sacrifice and appease the Romans, but because of Zechariah ben Akulis, they don't. The first scene shows the rabbis failing to lead the people morally by example. The second scene shows them failing as halachic leaders, lacking foresight and flexibility. Zechariah ben Avkulis chooses exactly the wrong moment to be punctilious, to worry about the possibility that some theoretical Jew might learn the wrong ruling from their actions, though his concerns here would seem to be absurd. The Talmud Bavli is reading themselves into the... Now, who's writing this? Who's the author of the Talmud Bavli? Who put it together? They're the rabbis. The Talmud Bavli spans approximately the year 200 to the year 500. Its ultimate editors, over the years, it's 300 years long. It's not like someone just left a pile of paper for someone to edit. Over the time, it's edited, but the final editing was done by two people, a man named Ravina, Resh Bet Yud Nun Aleph, and Rav Ashi. It's not Rav Ina, it's Ravina and Rav Ashi. And the people, the tens of thousands of lines, hundreds of thousands of lines that are filled with the names of rabbis and rabbis and rabbis and rabbis. So who wrote this story about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? Who wrote the story about the rabbis that were there and didn't do anything? Who wrote the story about the rabbi who didn't do something about doing Shlomachut? Who wrote the story about the Zechariah ben Avkulis? The rabbis themselves. So the authors of the stories in the Talmud Bavli itself are reading themselves into this tragic story and blaming the destruction on the failure of rabbinic leadership. He says, finally, the statement about Rav Zechariah ben Avkulis anvitanut, his humility, is attributed to Rabbi Yochanan, is fully integrated into the story in a way that makes sense. And it harkens back to the Midrashic quote of Rabbi Yochanan, in which we said, what is meant by the Pasuk in Mishlei where we started, happy is the man who is always cautious, but he who hardens his heart falls into misfortune. He says that's the connection to the Pasuk that this narrative starts off with. So what we have here right now is a potential answer as to why Kamsa is mentioned. We have a little bit more of an inkling into why it's not a matter of, one opinion is that Kamsa and Bar Kamsa caused the destruction, or was it Zechariah ben Avkulis? They worked together. We also see that the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa story is a symptom, not necessarily the actual event, a standalone event. But there's a word here that still needs to be needs to be translated in a different way. The word anava, means humility. There is I read yesterday, a roundabout way to explain how the word anava works in. It's a little bit, not convoluted, but it's a little bit too hard for me to focus on a day when my brain's not working at 100. Well, it's never, but even at 50%. But it has to do with the way the rulings were made in Sanhedrin. When they took the opinion of people in a death penalty case, they would start with the lowest man on the totem pole in Sanhedrin. When they took opinions, when it came to monetary, they took the opinion of the higher ranking. So of Kulis, who was the top guy, I'm just doing this off the top of my head, but I heard yesterday, Zechariah ben Avkulis, who was the top guy, and this is kind of a death penalty situation because the Jews' lives were at stake. He should have been the last one to weigh in. But because he wanted to say, no, I'm a nobody, I should go first, then he speaks up. And therefore, because of his humility, is what the implication of this article is, fake humility, that because of that, all the whole story takes place. But I saw other places that they translate the word, the anvitanut, the humility, was his hesitation, not the inability to make a decision. Because you see, there was no decision made. Indirectly, there was a decision. There was no korban brought. They didn't know what. Make a decision. That's part of being a leader. Is part of being a human being. When you are faced with a problem, when you're faced with a situation, you have to take a stance. You have to make, especially what's important. And we see the destructive issues when people don't stand up for the right thing. And one is, I can't get, because it's Tisha B'Av, we can't really talk much Torah other than what you're allowed to. Just think about the story of Korach and how absolutely the Torah does not mention a single soul that stood up to defend the honor of Moshe and Aaron. That's all I can say for today. So we see that these things happen. We also know that in the Torah that there's they have it are on the words, not in the Torah itself, but in books. The Ta'amei HaMikra, also known as trup, also known as cantillation marks, to tell the Chazan how to sing the words. There are a few that are very rare. It's called a Karnei Para and others, but there's one that appears only 5 times. It's called a Shalshelet. It's the one that any Balkari loves to do. It goes on and on and on. And it appears only 5 times. 4 of them in Breshit, 1 in Vayikra. The one in Vayikra seems to be an outlier, doesn't seem to fit the pattern I'm about to tell you. But if you one day want to know how it fits, and it's not Tisha B'Av, I'll clue you in. In the 4 that are in Breshit, they are always at a crossroads. A decision needs to be made. Again, without going into the whole story, because again, it's Tisha B'Av, when it's Lot is about to run away to leave Sodom, and he's about to run away. There's a word Vayit Mahama. He hesitated, and on that word is Shalshelet. There's a hesitation. There's a crossroads. What's going to happen? All 4 in Breshit, there's a crossroad. It's telling us that is part of what we do as humans, as Jews. We have to, when we come to a crossroad, when we come to something, and especially when it's super important, you have to decide. You can't whiffle waffle. You can't just sit there on the sidelines and not make a decision. And that's one of the problems that caused the destruction as well. We have the underlying theme of Sinat Chinam. It's played out with the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, and it's magnified by the lack of leadership and lack of decision-making by Zchai ben Avkulis and the Chachamim that were present. What were the Chachamim doing at that party? So there have been some opinions I've seen that say they were forced to be there. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Why didn't they open their mouths? Also, maybe I can't answer that. It was an absolute failure in leadership. 1 second, I'm sorry. Sure. Okay. Okay. I want to read something that's very short that was sent to me yesterday. I want to thank Martin Lifshitz for bringing this to my attention. There's a man named Eliakim Aronoff who learns in the Merkaz Daf Yomi and writes an article in a publication they put out weekly from here. For those of you who know, at least Stefanski may attend his Daf Yomi Shiur online. Nice Chicago boy, Lincolnwood, Chicago. Has thousands of attendees. He gives a different perspective of this Kamsa Bar Kamsa story. Short, I'm going to read it to you. And he says the following. He says, I'm basing my explanation on a thought I heard recently at a lecture. The lecturer asked us, is it a good idea to withdraw 20,000 shekel from your bank account? The instinctive answer is, depends. Depends on what you need the money for. But the lecturer's answer was, it depends on how much money you have in the bank. He went on to explain that the same way most people have bank accounts for money, all people have what he calls an emotional bank account. In the emotional bank account, a deposit is a compliment, and as a withdrawal is a criticism, even if it is constructive. Let me say that again. A deposit would be a compliment, and a withdrawal would be a criticism, even if constructive. You cannot criticize someone who does not have enough deposits saved up in his emotional bank account to be able to cushion the effects of the withdrawal criticism. The failure of the Jewish nation at the time of Bar Kamsa to act toward one another in the shuls, streets, and the community in a way that created a more positive atmosphere among each other by practicing V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha led to a situation where many of them, Bar Kamsa among them, had empty emotional bank accounts. It was this fragile emotional state that may have tipped Bar Kamsa over the edge when he was insulted by the party host and led him to take a very self-destructive course by complaining to the Romans. Had his emotional bank account been more full of compliments, he may have been able to withstand the withdrawal without acting in such an emotionally bankrupt manner. Therefore, the entire Jewish nation was to blame for failing to build the kind of unity, achdut, that truly would have prevented this tragedy. His theory is, I think it's kind of interesting, is that it's not just that, oh, he was a sensitive individual and he got thrown out, that the sinat chinam that was building at that time was raging, had been so prevalent throughout the city that it had actually hurt people's emotional state. And therefore, what might have been okay, I get thrown out, maybe I'll just curse the guy, I'll burn his house down or something, led Bar Kamsa to do something unimaginable. Yeah, to this day, we're still paying for. 2 more little comments, and then we're going to go back into the Gemara and to look at some of the other things that talks about the destruction of Beit HaMikdash. Rav Yehuda Amital Zichrono Livracha, tells us something very interesting. He said that the Gemara mentions that Kamsa's friend, quote, made a party. He said this wasn't a wedding or some other festivity of religious significance. It was a party for an enclosed, self-contained clique, characteristic of a splintered society. This group to which Kamsa belonged, and from which Bar Kamsa was publicly rejected, resembles an egrof, a fist, kamutz, a closed fist, which safely protects everyone within, but which is impossible to penetrate or to gain entry into. Indeed, this was the sin of Kamsa, his very membership in this exclusive clique. He's adding to what I had mentioned earlier. It's not that he was just part of this club and this is more of a sinat chinam club, but he's using the word Kamsa. The word here he's saying is like a fist, an egrof, kamutz. That, and it has lots of other meanings too, I know. There's an opinion that Kamsa and Bar Kamsa are actually father and son, because Bar Kamsa means the son of Kamsa. It also could mean it's fist against fist, that just by their names, it's a fist against a fist, that was already telling us in a remez and hint that they were adversaries already. But he's telling us an additional state that this clique was like this. It protected the people inside and kept people out. Another thing he tells us, the last point he makes, is as follows. It's short. I'm going to read it to you again. By the way, for those of you who come to my class, I don't just usually read something, but my apologies. The rabbis thus felt that the animal, although invalid for sacrifice, should be offered nonetheless, due to the potential danger to life, should the emperor's anger be aroused. The Zachariah ben Avkulis opposed the idea, fearing that people will mistakenly think the animals with defects may be offered on the altar, and the next suggestion, of course, was to kill Bar Kamsa, so he wouldn't go to spread false rumors. And again, Zachariah ben Avkulis said people will think that the animal's liable, so someone who wounds an animal would be liable for the death penalty. And this inaction, he says, led to the fruition of Bar Kamsa's plan and ultimately the destruction of the city. This prompted Rabbi Yochanan to issue this chilling statement about Zachariah ben Avkulis, that the modesty of Zachariah ben Avkulis destroyed our house, burned our temple, and exiled us from our land. This same declaration that had been made about the brutal Roman government is now applied to a scholarly rabbi. What is he referring to? The Gemara talks about, did and will, about the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, the burning of the temple, and the exile of the land. It's used about the Romans. Now it's that same wording is used and applied to Rav Zachariah ben Avkulis, is now applied to a scholarly rabbi who achieved considerable stature, but simply lacked the ability to reach a conclusive decision. When the need arises to decide, to adopt a definite approach, a leader who lacks this capability brings about calamity. This frightening combination of senseless, baseless hatred, a corrupt leadership, the rabbis who sat at the party without objecting to Bar Kamsa's humiliation, and a leader who lacked the capacity to reach a final decision, this combination led to the tragic destruction of Jerusalem. There are so many lessons that we can all get from this all we've done so far. People would say, well, that's a leadership issue, and that's not true. Every person, one degree or another, is a leader. It could be within your own family, your relationship. It could be if you are in whatever industry you're in or we're in. You have, and sometimes within your own community, your shul, your matanas, whatever it is, you have some form of leadership in you. Some are big leaders, some are less leaders, but we're all in some form leaders. The decisions we make on a daily basis, generally speaking, are not earth-shattering, and they don't bring about calamity when we don't decide. But sometimes those decisions that we make will be life-altering and hopefully for the good. Anyone listening here today that made Aliyah, I think it's all of us, at some point made a decision. Sometimes it was made for you, depending on your age, because you were brought to Israel. But most of us made the decision. And not just one day said, okay, tomorrow we're moving to Israel. I actually know some from the time they made the decision to the time they were in Israel was less than 8 weeks, which is mind-boggling. But most of us, it was weighing the pros and cons and ultimately realizing that the right thing to do is to be here in Israel, to make Aliyah. So those are life-altering decisions. We don't have those life-altering decisions every day, thank God. But we do have decisions. Are you going to go to the Makola? Are you going to go to Rami Levy? What are you going to eat for supper? Are you going to read this or learn this? Are you going to watch this on Netflix? Are you going to go to sleep? We're constantly making decisions. Part of the point of the Gemara here is that the weight of some of our decisions, we have to really take into account. A person who's wise, you see the ramifications of your decisions. Sometimes in social circles, people make decisions and they're not the best and smartest moves and don't realize the long-term effects they could have. So that's part of the lesson in this Gemara. What I want to do is I'm going to put the Gemara back on the screen. And put it, okay, we're going to start right over here where it says, here. Okay, we're starting there. Shadar ilvayu legeron kesar. Okay, and again, I'm going to read it from my Gemara, and hopefully I'll pay attention to the screen also, and make sure I get to the point to move the screen down. Let me find it here. Okay. After the story, after Shimon ben Zechariah ben Avkulis and Kamsa bar Kamsa, and the animals not brought as a sacrifice, evidently the Roman governor finds out, Caesar finds out the animal's not being brought. So what happens? Shadar alvayhu neron Caesar. So the Roman government sent Nero, Caesar, against the Jews. Kikaate, when he came to Yerushalayim, he wanted to know the people, the Caesars and the kings and the leaders within Rome were very religious people. I don't mean that they put talis and tefillin up. I meant that they believed in all kinds of signs and omens and gods, lowercase g, and all kinds of stuff. So he needed to figure out what his mission was. He needed to kind of invoke the gods. Shadagira the Mizrach. What he did, he came to Yerushalayim. He shot an arrow towards the east, and Atanafa Yerushalayim. It fell on Jerusalem. The Marav, he shot an arrow the opposite direction, towards the west. Atanafa Yerushalayim, and it fell on Yerushalayim. Then he sent it in all four directions of the heavens. It fell in Yerushalayim. So first test he does, it sure looks like the gods, again in quotes, are pointing to the need to do something against Jerusalem, but he's not satisfied. He does something that the rabbis in the time of the Talmud did. He co-opted this action and tested it. Okay, this comes a teeny little story. Many, many, many years ago, I know some of you have been here long enough to remember this, but I was only studying here then. When the TV stations would go off the air, it would either be Hatikva or something, and there was one station, that there were many, there was a little teeny Dvar Torah at the end before they would go off the air. And the first time I ever heard the expression, even though I maybe learned it in Gemara, never sunk in, was the Rav went over to a student coming out of the Beit Midrash and said, Psok li psukech. Literally means, Pasuk me your pasuk. Means, what did you just learn in the Beit Midrash? So
I remember that item on TV. It was called Psuko Shel Yom.
Psuko Shel Yom. Thank you. Excellent. I knew it had to have a name. Thank you, Paul. Psok li psukech. And sometimes it was, I can't say always because I don't remember every single situation. It was used to intuit a decision. Should the Rav, who he's thinking of something, do something? He was like, okay, because that's exactly the pasuk I needed to hear, that's what I'm going to do. Wasn't always used for that, but sometimes just to get to start a conversation. So he does this here. Amar le lianuka, look in the Gemara, we're over here now, right here. Amar le lianuka. So he said to a child, Sokli psukech, tell me the pasuk you learned today. Amar le, so he said to him, listen to what it says, the pasuk in Yechezkel, v'nafati et nikmati be'edom, b'yad ami Yisrael. I will put vengeance upon Edom by my hand of my people Israel. So in other words, he's going to do something. What does he mean? Amar. So Nero said to himself, this pasuk tells me that God's desires to destroy his house. Beit HaMikdash. And he wants that man to do it with his hands, meaning he's talking about himself. He's saying, oy vey. Because they weren't stupid. The Romans understood that the Jews and the God of the Jews, which they didn't realize the God of everybody, had some power. And he's a little bit concerned, having been sent to do something against Yerushalayim, even though all the signs point to him having to do it. He's a little bit skittish. Arak va'azal ve'igayir. What did he do? He went and he converted to Judaism. And Rabbi Meir, and who came from him as a descendant? Rabbi Meir. The Rabbi Meir, as in Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes, as in Rabbi Meir the Tana. Shadre Ilvayu Vespasianus Caesar. Okay, you might think that since Nero didn't do what he was supposed to do, that the king was going to be, okay, game over. Didn't work that way. We're over here now. Here. Shadare Ilvayu Vespasianus Caesar. So now the Roman government sent Vespasian. That name you should know. If you didn't know Vespasianus, you should know the name Vespasian. Again, to come against the Jews. Ata, he came to Yerushalayim, Tzaralat Latshan, and he laid siege against Yerushalayim for 3 years. Havu ba hanhu tlata etire. Now, before I can, actually, let me read the Gemara, and I'll give you the background, the story. They're in the city at the time of the siege. Were 3 very wealthy people. Now, sieges have been used for centuries. All you need to do is go back a little over 75 years ago, and we know that Yerushalayim was besieged by the Arabs. We know that if you drive on the road Kvish Achad between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv, you see that what were supposedly the armored Nebuch, the armored vehicles, a piece of steel on the side of a truck, that were ambushed by the Arabs by the area of Bab el-Wad, by Shar Hagai. Shar Hagai.
It's a bit
Beit
further
Meir
up.
and Shar Hagai, correct? That they were besieged. That's where he tried to come through and bring provisions. Of course, they built the Burma Road. Now, that's not now for Jewish history, but there was a siege. And of course, when you have a siege, people die. If it's more than a period of time, you run out of food, medicine, water in certain cases, which we'll see. So the 3 rich people in the city, Nakdimon ben Gurion, ben Kalva Savua, ben Tzitzit HaKisat. There are 3 people. One was named Nakdimon ben Gurion, one Kalva Savua, and one's named as Tzitzit ben Tzitzit HaKisat. And before the Gemara tells us what they did, in this case, they tells us an explanation why they were called these unusual names. Nakdimon ben Gurion, why was he called that? Because the sun shone on his behalf. This is a story which can't go into now because it's, again, the day it is in the Masechet Ta'anit about the sun needing to, it prevented him from some substantial loss, let's just say that. Ben Kalba Savua, why was he called that? Because it says, anyone who came to his house starving, hungry like a dog, would go out satiated. Ben Tzitzit HaKisat, why was he called that? That his tzitzis dragged on the blankets. Kesset is a blanket, because he wouldn't walk on the ground with his feet. They would put blankets under him because he was such a noble. Ika da Amri, others say, Shahita Kisto Mutelet Ben Gedol Romi, others say that his kisei, his Kisto HaKesset from his kisei, his chair, was found among the nobles of Rome, meaning he was a nobleman also. But that's just a parenthetical statement leading into the story. We are told that Vespasian puts a siege on the city. There are 3 rich people. Now let's see what happens. Keep in mind, don't lose sight of the fact. This entire Gemara is telling us about Sinat Chinam, not just about the destruction, but what led to destruction. Keep that in the back of your head as we read this. Chad Amar Lahu. So one of the leaders, one of these 3, said to the people running the city, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to feed the people of the city with wheat and barley. And the other one said, I will feed them with wine, salt, oil. I will feed them with wood. What does that mean? They'll have firewood, so they can use the above mentioned supplies. The rabbis gave special praise to the wood, the person providing the wood, because evidently it was even more expensive than everything else. The Rav Chisda called The Rav Chisda called Aklide have a masar l'shmai bar midatzive. So Rav Chisda, what did he do? He would give his keys to his servant, except for one key. It's telling us why with I guess the wood was so special. He would give his keys to his servant for all of his various storehouses, except the key for the woodshed. Damar Rav Chisda said, "Aklava dechite by shitin achlave detzive." That a storehouse with wheat requires 60 storehouses of wood for cooking. The would be enough to sustain them for 21 years. So this is another parenthetical statement, which is why the guy with the wood was praised so much, because evidently of all the things that would last the longest, not only would it help them cook and bake, it would have the longest sustainability of the other products. Fine. Now what happened? They have all these goods, they're storing them up in storehouses. Now the video I showed, if you were there at the beginning, I showed a video about what was happening, and very briefly they mentioned this story. Keep in mind, sinat chinam. Bahu hanau biryone. In the city of Yerushalayim at this time, there were some people will translate to zealots, but a biryon is a bully. Okay, there were some people who were extremists, they'd be called, maybe in our current language. Amrul Rabbanan. The rabbi said, yes. So the rabbi said, so the Chachamim said to these biryonim, tell you what we should do. Let's try and go make peace with the Romans. Lashavkinu, these bullies, these people who were, what I keep saying, okay, biryonim, they didn't allow this. They stood in their way. They said, no, nothing doing. You're not going to know Romans. Okay, you don't want us to go and try to make peace. Let's go to war against the Romans. Sorry, I said it wrong. Amrulahu. They said to the rabbis, meaning the zealots said to the rabbis, no, we're not going to make peace. Let's go to war with them. Rabbanan. So Rabbanan said to them, milta. You're not going to be successful. It's not going to happen. Look at our numbers. Look at their numbers. How much more they're supplied. Kamu klanu lahanu ambre dechite v'sare v'hava kafta. What did these people do? What did these extremist zealots, bullies do? They burned down the storehouses of food, of the wheat and the barley that caused a famine. Why did they do that? Because they did not want to make peace. They wanted to make war. And the only way they could force the hand of the, whoops, sorry. Right here. The only way that they could force the Jews to go to war instead of making peace was to force their hand, because it's either starve or go to war. Again, that is another sign of the extreme sinat chinam. So while this Gemara gives us an overview, and the Gemara continues, I don't have the time now because I'm going to go to Mincha in a couple minutes. While the Gemara has the basic story of the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, and we know that the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinat chinam, it gives us these additional insights that we know. Everyone knows about Bar Kamsa, and some of you knew already about Zechariah ben Avkulis, and maybe you knew the story about the burning of these storehouses. We cut off our own noses to spite our faces. Just was talking about Michael that the other day. Our biggest destroyers come from within, and that has been our problem historically for centuries. Whether it's Pablo Cristiani, who was a Jew and apostate, who converted and caused all kinds of problems for the Jews, time of the Ramban, and before him and after him, our biggest problems have been from our own ranks. I'm going to end with one thing, and I said this in Shul Friday night, with Dvar Torah. I said this in a number of classes recently, and it bears repeating. When the Jews come to Zechariah, Perek, I think it was beginning of Perek Zion, Jews come to Zechariah and they say, do we have to fast now that we have Shivat Zion, now that we're returned to Zion and we're building Beit HaMikdash, do we have to fast? And his answer is, he didn't answer you should fast. He didn't answer you don't have to fast. He tells them, in paraphrasing, do better in Beit Adam l'chavero, how you deal with your fellow man. What kind of answer is that? He's telling them, don't worry about if you have to fast or not fast. worry about something else. You have to be concerned that you don't have a Beit HaMikdash. You didn't have a Beit HaMikdash for 70 years. It's being rebuilt. What are you going to do to prevent it from being destroyed again? That's a better question. That is, work on your Ben Adam L'Chavero. I think the ultimate message of this Gemara, which we didn't finish, there's no way we're going to go through 2 good pages of Gemara at this short amount of time. The ultimate message is, yes, it's important to daven. Yes, it's important to learn Torah. Yes, it's important to do all the mitzvot Ben Adam L'Makom, between us and Hashem. It's critical. But Ben Adam L'Chavero, in many cases, they're going to talk about this on Shabbat Shuvah, Bezrat Hashem, is the Ben Adam L'Chavero, our how we treat each other, what we do with each other, and how we relate is, in a sense, to Hashem even more important. It is not one or the other. It's both. It's Ben Adam L'Makom, Ben Adam L'Chavero, and making sure we also treat both Hashem and our fellow man the right way. I am heading out, as they say in certain parts of the world. I'm going to go down to Mincha. For the rest of the fast, I do hope that you will have an easy fast. I want to mention one thing, that I did get a number of calls today, and messages. That's why I was checking my phone while I was teaching. If you have any symptoms, chas v'shalom, of dehydration, dizziness, nausea, lightheadedness, plain thirst is thirst. I'm talking about extreme thirst. You are not allowed to fast. You must drink. You don't have to eat, but you have to drink. I don't care if it was 6 hours ago or it's now just an hour and a half for the end of the fast. You have to drink. Okay, I'm not wishing anybody a good day. There's no greetings. We'll see you all at different classes. Bezrat Hashem. Have a good fast.